human resources, human capital, people and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you interviews from HR and industry thought leaders so you can listen, learn and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. To learn more about our sponsor, please visit ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out the AJO blog for additional HR learning tools and resources.
To HR Studio, I'm Fred Bunce. I'm your host for today's episode, and I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. David Drake. Dr. Drake is from Petaluma, California, which, for those of you like me who don't know where that is in Northern California, north of San Francisco. Dr. Drake has spent the last 30 years studying human dynamics, and he's focused particularly on the areas of change and transitions. He's had lots of roles in that space, including executive coach, a team and organizational development consultant. He's done lots of scholarship, having authored over 40 publications. And what his work has centered around is enabling leaders and organizations to embrace change and engage in successful transitions. He's brought an incredible amount of intellect and energy to the field. In fact, he's been innovative in a process he calls narrative coaching, which we're going to ask him to talk about. But quite simply, it's an approach to adult development which connects mindsets, behaviors, and environments. Mindsets, behaviors, and environments that drive sustainable change. Not only has he pioneered that approach, but he's also trained 10,000 people across about 14 countries in that process. And we're very excited to have him here with us today. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Fred.
Good to have you here. So please tell us a little bit about yourself. I've covered some of the basics, but tell us about yourself and how you've been working in this area of narrative coaching.
Yeah, like a lot of things, as you move through your career, you start to look back and think, how did I arrive here and what were the influences that got me to this particular point in time? And as I've done that over the years, I realized that part of my interest in narrative and in coaching was because of my own family of origin, where like many families in that generation, you just really didn't talk about things that were very important. You know, you had sort of that banal dinner conversation about school or work. But even like with deaths in the family or whatnot, it was just not something our family was particularly gifted at. And as I've moved through the years of my career, I've seen that that's really common for a lot of people. And I thought there's got to be a better way for people to connect. And so I've had this passion about how to help people liberate the stories they want to tell, connect to each other and understand their stories, and kind of move the whole community, whether it's a family, a team, or an entire company, into a new place. And so for me, I have this really sort of strange brain. I have a very systemic thinking brain, but my deepest passion is the human heart. And so I try to help organizations put those two worlds together.
That's fascinating. And how has that been received in organizations when you offer that kind of a new approach or a blended approach?
Well, most of them don't actually really care about all that stuff. What they really care about is, do we get good return on investments for our training and our coaching? And a lot of what I've done is sort of gone into organizations that have invested lots of money on more traditional programs around leadership development or coaching skills, and have really not seen that return. And I've offered them the possibility that in part that's because they're trying to impose some kind of new language or structure on human beings. And most of us resist those kind of things, even if we like them. And so we come in and we work really with the living stories in the company, dealing with people as just normal human beings, so that we're helping them improve what they already have rather than trying to impose something new on top of them. And so for me, what people appreciate is that, like when I did a big project for PwC, they could embed the approach in every single aspect of their business, from sales to customer experience to onboarding to leadership development, because it was a very simple human process and didn't contain a lot of fads or fancy language, even though it has 4 degrees of mind sitting behind it and lots of scholarship.
That's fascinating. And what were some of the things that led you to this? What were the ways that the normal development efforts didn't quite stick or sustain?
Well, because I realized, like many of us in this field, I started out doing a lot of training programs, and I felt like, some went better than others in terms of the experience, but I thought they're really not going to do anything because they're like passengers on a ship, right? Yeah. And many of them are veterans. They've seen all these things, come and go, and they try to take a few tips. And I thought, but what a waste of life and money just to get a few tips from a whole day spent together. It's a day I'll never get back again. And even if it was a positive experience, my observation was it really didn't change how people acted or talked at work. And so I just used a piece of work from a man named Paulo Freire in Brazil to kind of flip that. Instead of me starting with my content, trying to change them, I started with their stories and said, how would you like that to be different?
Wow.
And it just flipped the whole paradigm. And then it became quite powerful for people because I said, I know a lot about this, but I'm not here to teach you anything. I'm here to facilitate you moving to a new level of awareness or capacity for yourself. And so I found that I didn't really care what the smiley sheet said at the end of the workshop. I cared, do you have a better life? Do you run a better team? Is your business more successful? That's the only thing I care about for you. And that requires starting with where you're at, not where I think you should be.
So, see if I could summarize. You began with their own experiences and then had a process where they would connect that to the new content or the new thinking that you were trying to implement. I see.
So maybe their sales team is really struggling, or some of their customers are not happy right now, or they're not really adapting to a change very effectively. I want to help them tell me the story about that experience and say, what are you observing about yourself? What are you noticing? Here's maybe a few lenses I can give you to look through at what's happening for you. But then really inviting them to use their own knowledge and experience to say, oh, we can see that we used to do this and it worked really well. We've kind of gotten away from that. So great. So how did you get away from that? And what would enable you to get it back? And so I'm just facilitating their own growth, not trying to make them become something they're not or move them in a different direction.
I see. And were people receptive to that? Because it sounds quite vulnerable and not so corporate.
Yes. Well, so more traditional corporate buyers, and particularly even in HR, ironically, had a harder time because they were used to putting butts in seats and selling programs. And I would say, well, the ones we won, which were many, was can we just come do this for half of a day with a small group of people and I'll show you how this works? And it was just the proof, the evidence in the moment where they said, oh my God, this is like way better. And still there were challenges because people often didn't know what to call this or how to buy this. But the employees loved it because they actually got to be involved, which I'll share in a minute, with making their own workplace better.
That's fascinating.
And bosses liked it because it allowed them to save budget. And so we showed them quite clearly how it saved massive amounts of budget in some cases, but that it actually yielded a tangible benefit. And so when they could see the benefits, they didn't always understand the methodology in the beginning. It seemed a bit foreign to them and very different than school or courses or the usual things they were working for. They just appreciated it because it worked.
That's always the key motivator for the buyer, for the sponsor is, will this work? Will this work? That cures all kinds of concerns. Do you have an example, David, of an organization where you've used this that could give our audience of how this played out?
Well, just as a preface to that, I have this really sort of famous quote that I borrowed from a guy who used to run leadership at GE, and I've kind of put it in two halves, and I want to use this as a setup for this story that I think will be really helpful. So he was sort of the developer of the leadership programs at GE that went on to become quite famous and legendary for their success.
That's right.
But he said in the beginnings, Steve said, they actually weren't very good. And the results were people loved the program, but it made no impact on our business. And so he went back in and said, that's not acceptable. I got to go figure out what's happening here. And he came up with this sort of great line that you should never send a changed person back into an unchanged environment.
Wow. Repeat that one more time for our
Yes.
audience. What was
He
it?
said you should never send a changed person back into an unchanged environment, which is what they were doing. They had these amazing programs, but the environment hadn't moved at all. And the reality is the environment will almost always win.
Yes, always.
And so he said we have to change how we think about this. And it's really been influential for me in sort of shaping my sort of thinking about this. And I've also looked at the flip side of that, which is you should never send an unchanged person back into a changing environment, because then they're just caught off guard and not prepared. And
yeah, or blindsided even.
And so they're blindsided, and they don't really appreciate that. And so a lot of times companies don't want to invest in people. They want to just say, hey, go change, get over it, and move on. And they're trying to, it doesn't work well because people haven't changed themselves. And so this approach gets people involved in changing their own environment so it's more receptive to the changes they're trying to make to move forward as a company. And so an example I can think of is in terms of we built a couple of major leadership programs for a huge bank. And they were fine. They were very classic programs. People liked them. They got some good takeaways, solid research. But at the end of that, I thought, is this going to make any difference in the bank? And I said, if I came back from a year from now, no, nothing will have changed. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't get the academic partner in the bank to do anything about that, which was very frustrating. But we were saved, saved by the CFO of the entire bank, the most unlikely sponsor for this kind of a project in some ways. But he said, we have a major problem. We are the financial brains of the bank, but nobody listens to us because we're horrible at presentations. We don't know how to talk to people easily. We don't know how to translate financial gibberish or into something that people know what to do with. And we want to take one of the programs you built on communicating with influence, and we want to customize it for our leadership team. And so I said to them, I will only on one condition, and which I got the CFO's blessing on, which was that to come to the workshop, you actually had to bring a PowerPoint slide deck you were going to be presenting in the next 7 to 10 days.
Okay. So bring something to consider and to work on in the midst of the program. Right.
So we cut the program down by a day off the program, which he liked, nice budget savings. Mm-hmm. But we said, and you need to make sure that your people understand they cannot come into the room if they do not have their document, and they cannot leave the room until their document is fixed.
Okay.
And so we had people there until 7 or 8 o'clock at night because we said, and I think the worst one was like 55 pages for a 10-minute presentation, which was part of their problem.
Yes.
And we had a four-slide format based on a narrative arc. And we said when we turned our faculty into coaches, and we basically cut out 80% of the content, which wasn't helpful, and said we are only focused on one thing, that you have a rock star quality presentation when you leave, and here's the structure we want to give you. And so we did that. It was very disconcerting because they were used to being lectured at and given classic activities. And we said, no, our only job is to help you write this presentation in a profoundly different way. And then all kinds of resistance. Oh, we have to have that in there. Why? And we'd kind of go through that. At the end of the day, we had 30 people with these amazing presentations. The most wonderful for me was a woman who really took to this really well. And she had a presentation that night to the foundation of the board to raise money for a program for fiscal literacy for children in impoverished areas. And she got the largest grant in the history of the foundation that night using the presentation she created in our workshop.
Talk about immediate impact, immediate results. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was like a $7 million grant or something. And it was and she was so moved when she came back. And then when they came back and we said, we now have 90 seconds to communicate this to the CFOs because they're coming now. And so that was a new anxiety moment, but we got them through that. But the CFO was so impressed. He said, this will transform the way we talk to our bank and our people and our other leaders. And for me, it was because we narrowed the focus down to something they cared about. And we helped them focus on really excelling at that and that only. And all the only content we kept was whatever would serve them to specifically make their presentation the best that it could be. And then we turn the faculty from teachers into coaches to work with people individually to help them deal with the challenges they face themselves. And now the client has a template. They have live case studies. They've got now 30 champions across the business who are sharing this work with others.
Wow.
It's actually made an immediate impact on the bank.
Yeah. And just the trainer and the coach in me is just fascinated by this. How did you, what was your ratio of coaches or facilitators to participants?
We had, there was myself and two other faculty. One was academic, one was more of a practitioner. But we also kind of worked with the HR representative who was there as our host, if you will.
Right.
And she wasn't quite as skilled because this wasn't really her area, but she was helpful and she was really excited by this because she said, mostly I just come in and monitor and make sure people behave and, and come back on time. And she said, I actually got to do something and she loved it. And so for her, so we had 4 to 30 people basically.
I see. Okay.
But it was the same cost as before in terms of overhead, but in less time with far better impact.
And so, David, what would you say to our audience, who's next generation emerging and current HR leaders, and actually leaders in any functional area? What would you say to them as the takeaway or the lesson that they can try to implement, without having have gone through that program?
Yeah.
What would be some things they should think about that would empower them the same way?
Yeah, so I was just made some notes to myself just to kind of get ready for this call. But so I think 3 stand out for me about the way that companies don't handle change well. That I'm looking to the younger generation of HR leaders to really help us kind of move on to a new way of thinking about this. But one is that we tend to make programs for the average person, and we try to move the whole herd forward. But in reality, on whatever the topic and whatever the group, there's always exemplars, people that are already really good at this and really have experience or insights, maturity. So I want to use those exemplars as co-facilitators, as mentors, as modelers, if you will.
Okay.
So we really tap the brilliance that's already in the organization as opposed to thinking it's coming from the outside. So that's one, is tap the people you already have and their passion and their skill. The second thing is that one of the things we did for another bank was we got them to shift their development frame from we have to cascade these giant blobs of content or skills across 55,000 people, which is never going to happen, to this idea of campfires. How do we engage our employees in more intimate conversations so that they can take what we're trying to achieve as a bank and help them understand what that means for them in their context, but also report back to us as leaders what they're learning about what that means for them in trying to do a good job.
So they appropriate it locally, in effect, and then report out what they've learned to the leadership. Right,
and then leadership then can shift how they're communicating and where they're focusing, and it gets people more engaged in what they're doing. So my advice for your audience is really like, what are the conversations your employees and leaders need to be having? Are they having those conversations? If not, how can you facilitate this? And it's far less about content, and fancy proclamations and messaging and cascading, and more about campfires and conversations. And I think the third thing that I would look at is really around people are doing their best to just cope these days. And it's not always easy in many workplaces. They're overworked, they're stressed, they're on demand 24/7. And so really it's about how do we help people come back to being human together and look at focusing on fewer things at a time, things that matter specifically to the employees and their customers, and getting away from content as if somehow that itself is going to magically change anything. But really look at, what is this human being trying to do at work? How can I support them to be better at that, feel better about that, feel like it's making more of a difference? And so what we think about it in a simple way is we want to turn employees from consumers of development to contributors to development.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a powerful shift. So I hear you talking about three things: champions, finding champions for the concept, conversations and campfires, and having them appropriate locally, and then also I think the last piece sounded like it's a strong degree of focus around what will actually make a difference for them versus thinking about all content, all possible content that it has to come from within and they have to bring their own ideas to it.
Yes, and then we get them to focus not just on their own skills, but what's going on in their environment that's making it difficult for them to be at their best, and getting them engaged in changing their own environments. We've done a lot of projects with, particularly in government and healthcare, getting people to look at the things that get in their own way and how they can help amend them to make it easier for them to be at their best more often.
Wow, that's great. As we come to the close, this is a hard conversation to end because this is so fascinating and it's so aligned with how we at least think about clients as well. But David, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to just offer to our audience? Any other key ideas that you think would be helpful?
I was just thinking about, I made a couple of notes to myself, and I've sort of observed over the years, like, how do I try to simplify what people are yearning for at work? And I sort of came up with four sort of pieces that I think people are really hungry for. And you see this in the younger generations. They're kind of more tuned into this, and they're really struggling with, how do I find these things in bigger companies? If I can't do a startup or I'm not part of that kind of culture or don't have that opportunity. And I look at it, people want, I think, four things. And there's other things they want, but these seem key to me in change. They want to feel like they belong, and so that they're part of something that matters, right? They see a lot of their older generations putting in time to move up the ladder, but why? So the house is bigger, and like, what's the point of that really in the end? And they want to be around, they want to be involved in something that matters. They want to believe. They want to have faith in where they're going as an organization. And oftentimes they don't see that. They don't see that kind of compelling vision or mandate, or we think about it as burning passions more than burning platforms. But they want to believe that, yes, we're doing something good here. I want to go contribute this because I have faith in what we're doing.
Sure.
They want to know how to behave.
Difference.
Yeah, they want to make a difference.
Yep.
And it doesn't really matter what your job. You could be driving a truck, building servers. I've done them all. They want to know how to behave, which is really interesting, but not in terms of being told what to do, but they want to feel like what they're doing is contributing. They want to know, like, how could I be a better person at work? How can we organize ourselves differently? What is really expected of me? And they're really hungry for more authentic connections with people, more authentic conversations with people, because they're trying to do, like, I do a lot of work with high-tech companies. They spend all day in meetings. And they're like, but I don't feel like I get anything done, right? I never really talk to anybody. It's always in the meetings. And I want to know, how can I behave differently and work to create a different culture for ourselves so we feel like we're making meaningful contributions to what's going on? And then lastly, again, kind of looking across a wider horizon for them, they want to become. They want to know that what they're doing is going to improve their life, because we're all in this for ourselves at one level. And is it improving our future?
Yeah,
right. Is it improving our future, and not just the bottom line or the options values for their leaders, but it's making the world a better place. And I feel like we're at this turning point where more and more companies realize they have a corporate responsibility to try to have a sustainable future for the planet, for their own company, for their own communities. And so I think for me, it's like we've got to link up the journeys that individuals are on to move through their own life with the narrative and the journey the company's trying to be on, as well as how's that participating in the broader society. So
it's those are four really personal views, perspectives, I should say, about what an employee wants beyond the paycheck, beyond the little space in a cube and a jump seat. And that's good to keep in mind as people begin to think about roles and the ways that the culture of the organization can also be attractive and help them retain people as well. David, I really appreciate the time you've given us today. I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have a resource or something? I was fascinated about that story you did with the bank. If people wanted more information, is there something that you've got that we can share with our audience?
Yeah, so two things. So one is I have an article that was written up about the project at the bank and has more of an insight about the technical pieces we did in designing that program. But I'm happy to make that available to your listeners.
That's great.
Then I've got for those that are more interested in the coaching aspects of this, I've got a new edition of my book on narrative coaching that's just come out in the last 2 weeks. And that can we'll have a link that we can give people so they can go take a look at that.
Excellent. Yeah. So to our subscribers of our HR Studio podcast, those links will be in our show notes. And for those of you who are not yet subscribers, please go to hrstudiopodcast.com and sign up as a subscriber, and you'll be able to get those resources that David had mentioned, as well as the notes from this episode. So, David, once again, I want to thank you on behalf of our audience of rising HR leaders and other leaders out there. These insights have been really helpful. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
All right.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To download the show notes and discover additional information from this week's episode, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. To join the conversation, we invite you to visit our LinkedIn group, where you will connect with a growing community of current and future HR leaders.